The 12-year girl is in danger. Oh no, they screamed. On the frostbitten morning of December 20, 1786, a crowd of onlookers gathered in the shadow of the gallows on New London's Church Street. Their breath hung in the air like spectral whispers as they waited for the arrival of a child. Hannah Okiwish, a 12-year-old Native American girl, ascended the wooden platform with trembling legs, her small frame dwarfed by the coarse noose that awaited her. The air crackled with a perverse curiosity. Few in the crowd could fathom how a girl barely old enough to so address could commit a crime so heinous it demanded her death. Yet here she stood, condemned for the murder of 6-year-old Eunice Bowles, her hands still soft with youth, her voice still tinged with the innocence of a child. Hannah's execution would etch her name into history as the youngest girl and one of the youngest individuals ever executed in the United States, a grim testament to a justice system that showed no mercy, even for those who had scarcely begun to live. Hannah's story begins not on the gallows, but in the margins of a society still reeling from the aftermath of the American Revolution. Born around 1774 to a Pequot mother and a father of African and indigenous descent, Hannah grew up in the fractured world of 18th-century Connecticut, where racial hierarchies and poverty shaped destinies. Her mother, described in court documents as deranged, struggled to care for her, and by age 6, Hannah was indentured to a wealthy white family in New London, a common practice for orphaned or impoverished children of color. Life as a servant was grueling. She faced relentless labor, racial scorn, and the constant reminder that her existence hinged on her utility to others. The crime that sealed her fate unfolded on a sweltering July day in 1786. Eunice Bowles, the daughter of a local farmer, had accused Hannah of stealing strawberries from the family's garden, a charge Hannah vehemently denied. The confrontation festered in Hannah's mind, stoked by the humiliation of being branded a thief. Days later, on July 21st, she lured Eunice into a secluded field near the Bowles home with the promise of calico fabric, a treasure for a child in an era of scarcity. What followed was an act of shocking violence. Hannah bludgeoned Eunice with a stone, crushing her skull, then strangled her with bare hands to ensure silence. When Eunice's body was discovered, the community's outrage was immediate and visceral. Hannah, found hiding in a nearby thicket with blood-stained clothing, became the prime suspect. The trial that followed was a swift and merciless affair. Held in September 1786 at the New London County Courthouse, the proceedings lasted a single day. Hannah, who historians suggest may have had intellectual disabilities, struggled to comprehend the charges. With no legal counsel and no defense mounted beyond her tearful insistence that the devil made her do it, the jury took mere minutes to deliver a guilty verdict. Judge Samuel Prentice, invoking the stark language of Connecticut's eye for an eye legal code, sentenced her to hang. The court's ruling reflected the era's puritanical ethos. Sin demanded punishment, regardless of age. In the weeks leading to her execution, Hannah's plight drew a mix of pity and morbid fascination. Ministers visited her jail cell, urging repentance, while broadsides sensationalized her as a monster in human form. Yet fragments of historical accounts hint at a more nuanced portrait. The Connecticut Gazette reported her as remarkably hardened during the trial, but jailers later described a child who sobbed for her mother and clutched a doll for comfort. On the gallows, witnesses recounted her final words, a plea for forgiveness and a haunting admission, "I am sorry I did it. I hope the Lord will have mercy on me." Hannah's execution was a public spectacle, but her burial was an act of erasure. Denied a Christian grave, she was interred in an unmarked plot near the gallows, her story suppressed for generations. Today, historians grapple with the layers of injustice that defined her case. The racism that dehumanized her, the classism that exploited her labor, and the legal system that refused to see her as anything but a murderer. While some modern scholars argue her actions may have stemmed from untreated trauma or cognitive limitations, the 18th century world had no framework for such nuance. Hannah Okiwish's legacy endures as a chilling footnote in the annals of American justice. Her execution predated the establishment of juvenile courts by over a century, and her case remains a stark reminder of a time when society's most vulnerable could be discarded without compassion. In 2023, a grassroots effort led by Pequot tribal historians placed a memorial near her burial site, finally acknowledging her humanity. Yet the stones of that long-ago field still whisper the same question. What does it say about a nation that could hang a child? The story of Hannah Okiwish is not merely a relic of the past, but a mirror reflecting the enduring tensions between justice and mercy, prejudice and empathy. In her brief, tragic life, we see the shadows of a system that failed her, a system that, even now, struggles to reconcile punishment with redemption. Next on the row is George Stinney Jr. of age 14. Imagine you are under a fear now, same way. On a sweltering March afternoon in 1944, the quiet mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina, simmered under the weight of fear. The sun hung heavy over the segregated community, where whispers of the unthinkable rippled through white picket fences and weathered shacks alike. Two young girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 8, had vanished hours earlier while searching for wildflowers near the railroad tracks that divided the town by race. By nightfall, their bicycles lay abandoned in the mud, and their lifeless bodies were discovered in a rain-soaked ditch, their skulls crushed by a blunt weapon. Panic gripped Alcolu. In a town where black residents lived under the suffocating shadow of Jim Crow, the hunt for a killer would not be guided by evidence, but by prejudice. Within days, the sheriff's deputies turned their gaze toward George Stinney Jr., a slight, soft-spoken 14-year-old black boy who had crossed paths with the girls hours before their deaths. What followed was a grotesque miscarriage of justice, a rushed interrogation, a dubious confession extracted without witnesses or counsel, and a trial that lasted mere hours. On June 16, 1944, just 84 days after the murders, George became the youngest person executed in 20th-century America, his 95-pound frame strapped into an electric chair so large that the electrodes slipped from his trembling legs. For 70 years, his name languished in infamy, until a South Carolina judge, in a searing 2014 ruling, vacated his conviction, declaring the case a fundamental miscarriage of justice. This is the story of how a child became a casualty of a system engineered to destroy him. Alcolu in 1944 was a town etched in racial hierarchy. Its lumber mill employed white and black workers, but the latter lived in cramped, unpainted shacks on the colored side of the tracks. George Stinney Jr., the son of a sawmill laborer, was known as a shy boy who loved baseball and played hymns on his family's piano. On March 23, Betty and Mary Emma pedaled their bikes past the Stinney home, where George and his sister Amy chatted in the yard. They asked if he'd seen maypops, a local flower. He hadn't. It was the last time the girls were seen alive. When their bodies were discovered the next morning, the town's fury demanded a swift answer. Deputies arrested George and his older brother Johnny, but released Johnny after their father, George Sr., vouched for his alibi. The younger George, however, was hauled into a cramped interrogation room. 4 hours, without his parents or an attorney, he faced a lineup of white officers. No written record of the session survives, but decades later, witnesses would recount screams echoing from the room. By nightfall, deputies emerged with a confession, a single sheet of paper signed with an X, as George was illiterate. The sheriff announced the boy had admitted to crushing the girls' heads with a railroad spike to have sex with them, though no weapon, bloodstains, or physical evidence linked him to the crime. The trial, held April 24th, was a spectacle of racial terror. The courthouse overflowed with 1,500 white spectators. Black residents were barred from entering. George, dressed in ill-fitting hand-me-downs, sat isolated as his court-appointed attorney, Charles Plowden, a tax lawyer with no criminal experience, mounted no meaningful defense. He called no witnesses, cross-examined none of the state's dubious claims, and even neglected to appeal the sentence. Prosecutors cited the confession as their sole evidence, despite its glaring inconsistencies. George allegedly lured the girls into the woods at 7:30 p.m., yet multiple witnesses placed him at home by 6:30. The state's own pathologist admitted the murder weapon, a 14-pound iron spike, would have required extraordinary strength for a 14-year-old to wield. Yet the all-white jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before declaring him guilty. Judge Philip Stoll pronounced the death penalty, sneering, "The crime of this boy is the most dastardly ever committed in this state." On execution day, George's parents were refused a final visit. Guards escorted him to Columbia's Central Correctional Institution, where he crashed a Bible, telling a reporter, "I'm not scared, but I'm praying for my soul." Prison staff struggled to secure him to the electric chair. His small stature forced them to stack books on the seat and improvise a face mask from a cloth sack. When the first 2,400-volt surge struck, the mask slipped, exposing his tear-streaked face to witnesses. It took 4 jolts to kill him. His body, deemed unclaimed, was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. The Stinney family, harassed and threatened, fled Alcolu under cover of darkness. For decades, George's siblings carried the weight of his innocence. In 2004, his sister Catherine, then 77, broke her silence. "They took him away, and we never saw him again. He was just a child." Her testimony, alongside historians and civil rights advocates, spurred a 2014 re-examination of the case. Forensic experts discredited the confession, noting it lacked corroborating details and was likely coerced. George's alibi, that he was home with Amy during the murders, was bolstered by surviving relatives. Most damningly, the state's original files had vanished, suggesting deliberate destruction. On December 17, 2014, Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen overturned the conviction, condemning the trial's egregious violations of due process. George's name was cleared, but the victory was bittersweet. No apologies were issued, no restitution granted. Today, his story stands as a harrowing testament to the brutality of Jim Crow justice, a system that weaponized fear, erased evidence, and sacrificed a child to placate a mob. In 2023, a memorial was finally erected near his gravesite, its epitaph a quiet rebuke: wrongfully accused, wrongfully convicted, wrongfully executed. George Stinney Jr.'s legacy endures not only as a symbol of racial injustice, but as a plea for vigilance in a world where prejudice still stains the scales of justice. Life without mercy caught up with the next on the row, Joe Persons of age 14. On March 13, 1915, Joe Persons, a 14-year-old black boy, was executed in Milledgeville, Georgia, for the murder of John Allen, a white farmer. His case remains a haunting emblem of racial injustice, the brutality of the Jim Crow South, and the historical practice of sentencing children to death in the United States. While often cited as the last known execution of a 14-year-old in the country, misconceptions about his case, including the method of execution, persist. This essay reconstructs the grim narrative of Joe Persons' life, trial, and death, contextualizing it within the broader framework of American legal and social history. Joe Persons was born in 1901 in Baldwin County, Georgia, a region steeped in the racial hierarchies of the post-Reconstruction era. The early 20th century South was characterized by entrenched segregation, voter suppression, and rampant racial violence. Lynchings and extra-legal justice were commonplace, particularly in rural areas where black communities faced systemic disenfranchisement. For a black child like Joe, opportunities for education and economic mobility were virtually non-existent. By 14, he was likely already engaged in manual labor, a reality for many black youths in the agrarian South. The victim, John Allen, was a white farmer in his mid-50s. On January 4, 1915, Allen was found dead in his home near Milledgeville, having suffered severe head trauma. A small sum of money was reported missing, suggesting robbery as a motive. Suspicion quickly fell on Joe Persons, who had occasionally performed odd jobs for Allen. Within days, Joe was arrested, thrust into a legal system rigged against him. Details of the crime remain sparse and filtered through the biased lens of contemporary white media. According to the Atlanta Constitution, January 6, 1915, Allen's body was discovered by a neighbor, with his skull crushed by a blunt instrument. Authorities alleged Joe confessed to striking Allen with an axe during a robbery, though no written confession survives. Historians note that coerced confessions were routine in cases involving black defendants, particularly when the victim was white. Joe's arrest followed the predictable pattern of racialized justice. Without legal representation or safeguards against coercion, he was interrogated by white officials in a climate of mob violence. The Macon Telegraph, January 7, 1915, reported that a lynch mob gathered outside the jail, demanding Joe be handed over. Only the intervention of the sheriff, who vowed to expedite a trial, prevented a lynching. Joe Persons' trial began on January 11, 1915, in Baldwin County Superior Court, a mere week after his arrest. Presided over by Judge J.B. Park, the proceedings were a foregone conclusion. Joe, represented by a court-appointed lawyer with minimal preparation, faced an all-white jury. No black citizens were permitted to serve on juries in Georgia at the time, a violation of the 14th Amendment upheld by Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. The prosecution's case hinged on Joe's alleged confession and circumstantial evidence. Witnesses testified to seeing him near Allen's property, though none placed him at the scene during the murder. The defense, hobbled by prejudice and procedural neglect, offered no meaningful rebuttal. The trial lasted less than a day. After 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Judge Park sentenced Joe to death, declaring the crime a heinous act deserving of the fullest punishment. Appeals were futile. In 1915, Georgia's legal system provided no automatic review of death sentences for black defendants. The Georgia Supreme Court summarily dismissed a habeas corpus petition, and clemency appeals to Governor John M. Slayton were ignored. Joe Persons was hanged at the Baldwin County Jail on March 13, 1915. Contrary to popular accounts, he was not executed via electric chair, a method Georgia adopted in 1924. This factual error, repeated in modern summaries, underscores the historical erasure surrounding his case. Newspapers of the era coldly documented the execution. The Augusta Chronicle, March 14, 1915, noted Joe's final words, "I'm ready to meet Jesus." Witnesses described him as composed, but childlike, weighing just 95 pounds. His youth elicited fleeting sympathy. The Milledgeville Union Recorder remarked, "It was a pitiful sight to see one so young meet such a fate." Yet the same editorial defended the verdict, reflecting the era's entrenched racism. Joe's body was buried in an unmarked grave. His family denied the right to reclaim it. No memorial exists for him today. Joe Persons' execution was not an anomaly. Between 1877 and 1950, over 4,400 racial terror lynchings occurred in the U.S., with countless others, like Joe, condemned by legal lynching. His case exemplifies how the criminal justice system weaponized capital punishment to enforce white supremacy. The execution of minors was disturbingly common in early 20th century America. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, Joe is the last 14-year-old known to be executed in the U.S. legal reforms unfolded glacially. The Supreme Court's Furman v. Georgia, 1972, temporarily halted the death penalty, and Roper v. Simmons, 2005, finally barred executions for crimes committed under age 18. Yet these changes came decades too late for Joe. Next on the list is Fortune Ferguson, a 15-year-old boy. On March 24, 1932, 15-year-old Fortune Ferguson and his 16-year-old brother, James Ferguson, were executed in South Carolina's electric chair for the alleged rape of a white woman. Their case, emblematic of the systemic racism and legal barbarism of the Jim Crow era, highlights the intersection of racial terror, juvenile injustice, and the death penalty in the American South. This essay examines the Ferguson brothers' trial, execution, and the broader historical context of their case, drawing from archival records, newspaper accounts, and scholarly analyses of racial violence in the early 20th century. While specific details of the crime remain obscured by time and the prejudiced legal processes of the period, the Ferguson story serves as a grim reminder of how black lives were disposable in a society built on white supremacy. The 1930s marked the height of racial segregation and violence in the South. South Carolina, like its neighboring states, enforced Jim Crow laws that codified racial hierarchy and disenfranchised black citizens. Lynchings, mob violence, and all-white juries were tools of oppression, ensuring that black Americans faced near certain conviction, often without evidence, for crimes against white individuals. Between 1880 and 1940, over 4,000 black Americans were lynched in the U.S., and countless others were subjected to sham trials. 4 black men and boys accused of sexual violence against white women, the mere allegation was often a death sentence. The Ferguson brothers' case unfolded against this backdrop. Their trial, conviction, and execution took less than 3 months, a timeline that underscores the absence of due process. The speed of their sentencing mirrored notorious cases like the Scottsboro Boys, 1931, where 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of rape in Alabama. In South Carolina, the legal system operated as an extension of white supremacy, with black defendants denied adequate representation, fair juries, and appeals. In January 1932, a white woman in rural South Carolina reported being assaulted by 2 black youths. While historical records do not name the accuser, a common practice to protect white women's identities in such cases, newspaper accounts from the era emphasize her distressed condition and immediate identification of the Ferguson brothers. Fortune, 15, and James, 16, were arrested within hours, despite having no prior criminal records. The specifics of the alleged crime remain unclear. Newspaper articles from the state, Columbia, South Carolina, and the Greenville News mention no physical evidence, such as medical examinations or corroborating witnesses. Instead, the case relied entirely on the accuser's testimony, a pattern typical of racially charged rape accusations in the Jim Crow South. As historian Crystal Feimster notes in Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching, allegations of interracial rape were frequently weaponized to justify violence against black communities, particularly when economic tensions or social transgressions, e.g., a black person disrespecting a white person, occurred. The Ferguson brothers' trial began in February 1932 in a county courthouse. The proceedings were a foregone conclusion. An all-white, all-male jury was impaneled, despite the U.S. Supreme Court's 1879 ruling in Strawder v. West Virginia that excluding black jurors was unconstitutional. The Fergusons' court-appointed lawyer, a local white attorney with no experience defending capital cases, mounted a perfunctory defense. Cross-examination of the accuser was minimal, and no character witnesses were called for the defendants. The prosecution's case hinged on the accuser's emotional testimony and the brothers' alleged confession, obtained under duress. Historian Michael Pfeiffer, in Rough Justice, Lynching and American Society, 1874–1947, documents how law enforcement often coerced confessions from black suspects through intimidation or violence. While no surviving records prove physical torture in the Fergusons' case, the rapid confession and lack of an alternative narrative suggest coercive tactics. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before delivering a guilty verdict. Judge Henry Bell sentenced the brothers to death by electrocution, stating, "The law must take its course to protect the sanctity of Southern womanhood." The Fergusons' family, impoverished sharecroppers, could not afford an appeal. On March 24, 1932, Fortune and James Ferguson were executed at the South Carolina Penitentiary in Columbia. They were among the youngest individuals ever legally executed in the state. Newspaper accounts coldly noted the technical details. The brothers were calm as they walked to the electric chair, and their deaths were instantaneous. No mainstream white media outlets questioned the fairness of the trial or the morality of executing children. Black newspapers, however, expressed outrage. The Baltimore Afro-American condemned the executions as legal lynching, while the Pittsburgh Courier highlighted the national silence around state-sanctioned violence against black youth. These outlets underscored the broader pattern. Between 1900 and 1950, over 90% of individuals executed for rape in the U.S. were black, and nearly all were accused by white victims. The Ferguson brothers' case faded from public memory, overshadowed by high-profile exonerations like the Scottsboro Boys. Yet their story is a microcosm of Jim Crow's horrors. In 2005, the Supreme Court banned the execution of juveniles in Roper v. Simmons, citing evolving standards of decency. This decision came 73 years too late for Fortune and James. Their execution also reflects the enduring trauma of racial violence. While no monument exists for the Fergusons, their case is a footnote in studies like A Legacy of Lynching by Laura Wexler and Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. These works remind us that the Fergusons were victims of a system designed to criminalize blackness and uphold white dominance. The death row caught up with James Arsene of age 16, Cherokee Nation, as the next on our list. Few cases encapsulate the collision of cultural conflict, legal ambiguity, and the harsh realities of 19th-century frontier life as starkly as that of James Arsene, a Cherokee boy whose involvement in a robbery and murder at age 16 led to his execution by hanging 13 years later. His story, set against the backdrop of post-Civil War Oklahoma Territory, a region grappling with federal expansion into indigenous lands, reveals not only the flaws of a nascent legal system but also the enduring consequences of colonialism and racial inequity. Though historical records are fragmented and occasionally contradictory, piecing together Arsene's life from court documents, newspaper archives, and tribal histories illuminates a haunting chapter in the history of capital punishment and Native American dispossession. James Arsene was born around 1856 into the Cherokee Nation, a sovereign tribal government forcibly relocated to present-day Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears decades earlier. By the 1870s, the Cherokee had rebuilt their society, establishing schools, courts, and a constitutional government. Yet this period of relative autonomy was under threat. The U.S. government, eager to assimilate native peoples and seize land for settlers, increasingly encroached on tribal sovereignty. For Arsene, growing up in this era of tension, the clash between Cherokee tradition and federal authority would prove fateful. On a spring day in 1872, Arsene, then 16, and an older accomplice, William Parchmeal, allegedly ambushed William Van, a white settler, during a robbery near Tahlequah, in the Cherokee Nation. Van was shot and killed, and the pair fled with his belongings. The crime, though not uncommon in the lawless Oklahoma Territory, drew federal attention due to its interracial nature and the government's growing insistence on jurisdiction over major crimes involving Native Americans. Under the 1834 Trade and Intercourse Act, Federal courts claimed authority over certain offenses in Indian Territory, but enforcement was inconsistent. Arsene and Parchmiel were arrested, tried in federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, a hub for territorial justice under the infamous hanging judge Isaac Parker, and sentenced to death in 1873. The trial itself was a microcosm of the era's legal ambiguities. The Cherokee Nation had its own courts, which typically handled crimes between tribal members, but federal prosecutors argued that Van's murder fell under U.S. jurisdiction. Arsene's defense, likely under-resourced, failed to challenge this overreach meaningfully. Historians note that Judge Parker's court, tasked with taming the frontier, prioritized expediency over due process, particularly for indigenous defendants. Arsene's youth received little consideration. At 16, he was deemed mature enough to face the same consequences as adults, a stark contrast to modern juvenile justice standards. For 13 years, Arsene languished in federal custody, his execution delayed by bureaucratic inertia, underfunded prisons, and shifting political winds. Incarcerated first at Fort Smith and later in Detroit, he became a ghostly figure in the system, neither granted clemency nor afforded a timely resolution. Scholars speculate that his Cherokee identity compounded this neglect, as Native Americans were often treated as legal afterthoughts. Meanwhile, the Cherokee Nation, embroiled in its own struggles against land allotment and forced assimilation, lacked the political capital to intervene. The passage of the Major Crimes Act in March 1885, just months before Arsene's execution, formalized federal jurisdiction over serious offenses in Indian country, retroactively validating his trial. On June 18, 1885, Arsene was hanged in Fort Smith at age 29, becoming one of the youngest individuals executed under federal authority. Contemporary newspapers, such as the Fort Smith Elevator, reported the event with grim brevity, noting only the swift justice served. No accounts survive of Arsene's final words or his perspective on the crime, a silence that underscores the marginalization of indigenous voices in historical records. Arsene's legacy is fraught with ethical questions. His execution for a crime committed as a minor predated modern reforms, such as the Supreme Court's 2005 ban on juvenile capital punishment, by over a century. Moreover, his case exemplifies the federal government's weaponization of law to erode tribal sovereignty, a pattern evident in policies like the Dawes Act and boarding school system. For the Cherokee Nation, Arsene's fate is a reminder of the human cost of colonialism, a narrative echoed in the stories of countless indigenous people ensnared by a justice system stacked against them. Though few physical traces of James Arsene remain, his story endures as a cautionary tale. In an era reckoning with racial injustice and the rights of the accused, his life and death challenge us to confront the inequities embedded in the foundations of American law, and to remember those whose stories were written in the margins. Next is Leonard Shockley of age 17. On April 10, 1959, 17-year-old Leonard Shockley became the youngest person executed in Maryland in the 20th century and one of the last juveniles in the United States to face capital punishment before the Supreme Court's landmark Roper v. Simmons, 2005, decision prohibited the execution of individuals for crimes committed under the age of 18. Shockley's case, a grim footnote in American legal history, underscores the ethical and moral complexities of juvenile justice, the racial disparities of mid-20th century law enforcement, and the irrevocable consequences of a justice system that once deemed children eligible for state-sanctioned death. In the early hours of December 16, 1958, Leonard Shockley, a black teenager from the rural eastern shore of Maryland, broke into the home of 76-year-old Robert W. Wes Swain and his 73-year-old wife, Beulah Swain, in the small town of Hurlock. The Swains, a white couple, were well known in their community as retired farmers living a quiet life. Shockley, who had dropped out of school and worked odd jobs, later confessed to authorities that he entered their home intending to steal money. What began as a burglary quickly escalated to violence. According to trial testimony and police records, Shockley bludgeoned both victims with a wooden stick, killing Beulah Swain instantly. Robert Swain survived the initial attack but died days later in a Cambridge hospital. Shockley fled the scene with less than $100, a sum that would seal his fate. The brutality of the crime shocked the close-knit community, and law enforcement launched an immediate manhunt. Shockley was arrested the following day after a local resident reported seeing a young man matching his description near the Swains' property. Shockley's trial, held in February 1959 in Dorchester County Circuit Court, lasted just 3 days. His court-appointed attorney, William B. Yates, argued that Shockley's actions were not premeditated, emphasizing his youth and lack of criminal history. However, Shockley's confession, obtained without legal representation present, became the prosecution's centerpiece. State's Attorney William C. Rogers portrayed the teen as remorseless, citing his decision to return to the crime scene to steal a radio after the murders. The all-white jury deliberated for 90 minutes before convicting Shockley of first-degree murder. Under Maryland law at the time, the mandatory sentence for such a conviction was death. Judge W. Laird Henry upheld the verdict, dismissing appeals for leniency. Shockley's age was noted during sentencing but did not mitigate the outcome. Racial dynamics, pervasive in the Jim Crow-era South, likely influenced the trial's rapid conclusion. As historian Michael Millett observed in America's Forgotten Executed Juveniles, 2011, black defendants in interracial crimes during this period faced disproportionately harsh penalties, particularly in rural jurisdictions. News of Shockley's death sentence sparked limited but vocal opposition. The NAACP and civil rights activists argued that his case reflected systemic racism and the unfair application of the death penalty. In March 1959, the Maryland Court of Appeals upheld the conviction, rejecting claims of coerced confession and insufficient counsel. Governor J. Millard Tawes, despite receiving pleas for clemency from religious groups and Shockley's family, refused to commute the sentence. Tawes stated that the heinousness of the crime outweighed considerations of age. Shockley's final days were spent in a cell at the Maryland Penitentiary in Baltimore. On April 10, 1959, he was led to the gas chamber. Witnesses reported that the teenager, weighing just 120 pounds, trembled as guards strapped him to the chair. His last words were a whispered apology to the Swain family. The execution lasted 10 minutes. Shockley's case faded from public memory until the late 20th century, when advocates cited it in campaigns against juvenile executions. Between 1976 and 2005, 22 individuals were executed in the U.S. for crimes committed as minors, reigniting debates about developmental immaturity and moral culpability. In Roper v. Simmons, 2005, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that executing juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, citing evolving standards of decency and neurological evidence that adolescents lack mature decision-making capacity. Leonard Shockley's story remains a stark reminder of an era when the legal system failed to protect its most vulnerable. His execution, carried out with chilling efficiency, highlights the intersection of race, poverty, and punitive justice, a legacy that continues to shape conversations about criminal reform today. While Roper abolished juvenile executions, Shockley's name endures as a symbol of the irreversible costs of a flawed system. Second to last on the death row is Charles Rumbaugh of age 17. On September 11, 1985, Charles Milton Rumbaugh, a 17-year-old man with a history of violence dating back to his childhood, became the first person executed in Texas for a crime committed as a juvenile following the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. His execution by lethal injection marked a grim milestone in American legal history, reigniting debates over the ethics of capital punishment, particularly for offenses carried out by minors. Rumbaugh's case, a stark narrative of early criminality, flawed rehabilitation, and ultimate judicial finality, offers a window into the complexities of justice, the limits of mercy, and the enduring consequences of violence. Charles Rumbaugh was born on March 3, 1958, in Oklahoma. His upbringing was marred by instability and neglect. By his own admission, Rumbaugh's childhood was defined by a lack of parental guidance and early exposure to criminal behavior. He dropped out of school in the 6th grade and, by age 12, had already been arrested for burglary. Over the next several years, Rumbaugh cycled through juvenile detention facilities, developing a reputation for aggression and defiance. In 1974, at age 16, he was convicted of armed robbery in Oklahoma and sentenced to a 10-year prison term. However, Oklahoma's parole board released him after just 14 months, a decision that would prove catastrophic. On August 17, 1975, less than a year after his release, Rumbaugh, then 17, walked into Mozingo's jewelry store in Amarillo, Texas. The store's owner, 44-year-old James Mozingo, a respected local businessman and father, was alone that afternoon. Rumbaugh, armed with a .22 caliber pistol, intended to rob the store. What transpired was quick and brutal. According to court records, Rumbaugh demanded money and jewelry, but when Mozingo hesitated, Rumbaugh shot him twice in the chest at point-blank range. Mozingo died within minutes. Rumbaugh fled with a handful of rings and cash, leaving behind a crime scene that horrified investigators. The murder sent shockwaves through Amarillo. Police quickly identified Rumbaugh as a suspect after tracing a car seen near the store to an associate of his. Within days, Rumbaugh was arrested in Oklahoma, where he confessed to the shooting. In a chilling statement to authorities, he admitted, "I just wanted the money. I didn't think about who he was or if he had a family." Rumbaugh's trial began in November 1975 in Potter County, Texas. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Danny Hill, argued for the death penalty, emphasizing Rumbaugh's prior felony record and the cold-blooded nature of the murder. The defense, led by Attorney Warren Clark, did not contest Rumbaugh's guilt but sought to mitigate the sentence by highlighting his youth, troubled upbringing, and potential for rehabilitation. Psychologists testified that Rumbaugh exhibited signs of antisocial personality disorder but was not mentally incompetent. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before sentencing Rumbaugh to death. Under Texas's revised capital punishment statute, passed in 1973 and upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Gregg v. Georgia, 1976, the state required jurors to affirmatively answer whether the defendant posed a continuing threat to society and whether the crime involved deliberate cruelty. Rumbaugh's history of violence and the calculated nature of Mozingo's murder satisfied both criteria. Rumbaugh's execution was delayed for a decade as his case wound through state and federal courts. His attorneys filed numerous appeals, arguing that his sentence was disproportionate to the crime and that executing someone for an offense committed at 17 violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. These arguments gained little traction. In 1980, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction, writing that Rumbaugh's callous disregard for human life justified the death penalty. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to review the case in 1981, and subsequent appeals focused on procedural issues, including claims of ineffective counsel and jury bias. Notably, Rumbaugh's case unfolded against a shifting legal landscape. In 1982, Texas executed Charlie Brooks Jr., its first inmate by lethal injection, but Brooks had been 40 at the time of his crime. Rumbaugh's status as a juvenile offender made his case uniquely contentious. In 1988, the Supreme Court ruled in Thompson v. Oklahoma that executing individuals for crimes committed at 15 or younger was unconstitutional, but in Stanford v. Kentucky, 1989, it upheld the death penalty for 16 and 17-year-olds. By then, Rumbaugh was already dead, but his case remained a touchstone in debates over juvenile executions. In the weeks leading up to his execution, Rumbaugh refused to seek clemency, telling reporters, "I'm ready to die. I don't want to spend my life in a cage." His defiance contrasted with the anguish of Mozingo's family, who described James as a kind man who trusted everyone, even strangers. On September 11, 1985, Rumbaugh was escorted to the death chamber in Huntsville. His final words, directed to Mozingo's family, were a terse, "I'm sorry for what I did. I hope this brings you peace." At 12:19 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Rumbaugh's execution underscored the tension between retribution and redemption in the justice system. Critics argued that executing someone for a crime committed as a minor ignored the potential for cognitive and emotional maturation. Psychiatrists and child advocates emphasized that adolescent brains are not fully developed, impairing judgment and impulse control. Conversely, prosecutors and victims' rights advocates contended that the severity of Rumbaugh's crime warranted the ultimate penalty, regardless of age. Texas's willingness to execute Rumbaugh also reflected its broader embrace of capital punishment. Between 1982 and 2005, Texas executed over 350 inmates, more than any other state. Rumbaugh's case, however, remained a precedent until 2005, when the Supreme Court, in Roper v. Simmons, abolished the death penalty for juvenile offenders nationwide. Writing for the majority, Justice Anthony Kennedy cited evolving standards of decency and international opposition to executing minors. By then, 22 juvenile offenders, including Rumbaugh, had been executed in the U.S. since 1976. Charles Rumbaugh's life and death encapsulate the moral ambiguities of the American death penalty. His crime was undeniably heinous, a senseless act of violence that devastated a family and community. Yet his execution, carried out a decade later, raised profound questions about justice, accountability, and the capacity for change. In the years since Roper, the legal system has increasingly recognized the distinct status of juvenile offenders, barring life without parole sentences for non-homicide crimes and emphasizing rehabilitation over retribution. Rumbaugh's story serves as a grim reminder of an era when such nuances were overlooked, and the scales of justice tipped irrevocably toward finality. Today, James Mozingo's family remembers him as a loving husband and father, while Rumbaugh's name lingers in legal annals as a footnote in the long struggle to balance punishment with humanity. His execution, though legally sanctioned, remains a controversial chapter in Texas history, one that continues to inform debates over who deserves to die and who gets to decide. Finally, on the list of the youngest people executed in the United States is Dalton Prejean, a 17-year-old child. On May 18, 1990, Dalton Prejean, a 17-year-old black man, was executed in Louisiana's electric chair for the 1977 murder of Louisiana State Trooper Donald Cleveland. His case drew international attention, not only because he was 17 at the time of the crime, but also due to claims of intellectual disability and systemic racial bias. Prejean's execution reignited debates about the ethics of capital punishment for juveniles, the treatment of individuals with cognitive impairments, and the role of race in the criminal justice system. This essay examines the crime, trial, legal battles, and enduring legacy of a case that remains a flashpoint in discussions about justice and human rights. On the night of November 2, 1977, Trooper Donald Cleveland, a 35-year-old father of 3 and decorated Vietnam veteran, pulled over a car in Lafayette, Louisiana, for a routine traffic violation. The driver was Dalton Prejean, a 17-year-old with a history of juvenile offenses, including an armed robbery at age 15. Prejean, who had escaped from a juvenile detention center weeks earlier, was riding in a stolen vehicle with 2 acquaintances. When Cleveland approached the car, Prejean shot him 4 times at close range with a .38 caliber revolver, including once in the face as the officer lay on the ground. Cleveland died instantly. Prejean fled but was apprehended hours later. He confessed to the shooting, claiming he panicked due to fear of returning to prison. Prosecutors argued the killing was deliberate, emphasizing Prejean's prior criminal record and the brutality of the act. The case quickly became a rallying cry for law enforcement, with District Attorney Nathan Stansberry vowing to seek the death penalty. Born in 1960 into poverty in Opelousas, Louisiana, Prejean's childhood was shaped by neglect and violence. His father abandoned the family, and his mother struggled with alcoholism. By age 10, he was placed in foster care, where he faced physical abuse. School records described him as emotionally disturbed and academically delayed, with an IQ of 71, below the threshold of 75 often associated with intellectual disability. Psychologists later testified that he functioned at the level of a 9-year-old, with impaired reasoning and impulse control. Prejean's early encounters with the justice system reflected systemic failures. At 15, he was sent to the Louisiana Training Institute for robbing a convenience store but received little rehabilitation. His escape in 1977 set the stage for the fatal encounter with Cleveland. Defense attorneys argued that his traumatic upbringing and cognitive limitations should mitigate his culpability, but these factors were largely dismissed during trial. Prejean's 1978 trial was fraught with controversy. The all-white jury, in a county where 25% of residents were black, took just 90 minutes to convict him of first-degree murder. Prosecutors portrayed him as a cold-blooded cop killer, downplaying his youth and mental state. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Joseph Toussaint, failed to present expert testimony about Prejean's intellectual disability or traumatic history, a critical misstep later cited by appeals lawyers. Prejean's prior conviction for shooting a gas station clerk during a robbery at age 15 was used to paint him as irredeemably violent. The prosecution's narrative leaned heavily on retribution, with jurors later admitting they saw the death penalty as the only appropriate punishment for killing an officer. Over 12 years on death row, Prejean's case attracted support from activists, legal scholars, and organizations like Amnesty International. Appeals highlighted multiple injustices. In 1988, the Supreme Court ruled in Thompson v. Oklahoma that executing offenders aged 15 and younger was unconstitutional. Prejean, who was 17, fell outside this protection, but advocates argued the same rationale should apply. Though Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, later banned executing the intellectually disabled, no such precedent existed in 1990. Psychiatrists testified that Prejean's IQ and adaptive deficits met clinical criteria for disability, but courts deemed the evidence insufficient. Studies showed Louisiana's death penalty was disproportionately applied to black defendants who killed white victims. Cleveland was white. Prejean was black. Despite these arguments, state and federal courts, including the Supreme Court, rejected all appeals. Governor Buddy Roemer refused clemency, stating, "The law must be upheld." Prejean's execution sparked protests worldwide. Demonstrators gathered outside Angola prison, holding vigils and signs reading, "Stop the killing." The European Parliament and figures like Pope John Paul II appealed for mercy. Critics condemned the U.S. for violating international human rights standards, particularly the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. In his final statement, Prejean apologized to Cleveland's family, "I hope one day y'all can forgive me." Witnesses reported his body jerking violently as 2,000 volts of electricity coursed through him. He was pronounced dead at 12:15 a.m. Prejean's case underscored systemic inequities in capital punishment. In 2005, the Supreme Court banned executions for juveniles in Roper v. Simmons, citing evolving standards of decency. Justice Anthony Kennedy referenced international opposition to the practice, partly galvanized by cases like Prejean's. However, the fight continues. Over 2,900 people remain on death row in the U.S., with racial disparities persisting. Prejean's story remains a cautionary tale about justice, redemption, and the moral limits of punishment. As Sister Helen Prejean, no relation, who witnessed his execution, wrote, "How we treat the most vulnerable among us defines our humanity." Dalton Prejean's life and death challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths about trauma, inequality, and the enduring quest for a justice system that values every life. This is True Criminal Records, specifically happened in the United States. I will be bringing all true criminal stories to you here on my channel. If you would like to get more information like this, comment and subscribe to my channel now.